street, we've met them, they've been there
I
looking
mean,
a
we
lot.
have a pool and
That
it's
lot's
almost
underwater.
overflowing.
I don't know how they're gonna build on that thing, and it's not just underwater
I was
today.
just laying there,
It's
so
been
I was like,
underwater
God, I
for
would love
weeks
this
now.
weather.
It was crazy. I mean, I think it was raining a long
No.
hard.
I was surprised I was able to get out of downtown, because I thought this morning, oh, my normal route's gonna be flooded, because normally it is, and it was, and I was like, wow, I guess the hard,
Where are you? I thought you lived on the Jones side.
no, I live downtown, so I'm building a house on John's Island, but I'm still downtown, I'm right at Upper King at meeting Uchi where all the flooding is, always happens.
Well, I am surprised you got out.
Yeah,
Oh, I got an extra one.
no water.
Yeah.
And then at
They
Hayes,
pull it in our
right
place.
at Citadel, it's
Oh.
always, they now have marker there, nothing. So it must have came in at low tide or something.
Yeah, well, thank goodness for small favors, I guess.
I know, cause I was fine, I was really surprised.
No, I'm trying.
Are you driving to Wisconsin?
Yes.
That's what I
Mount
thought.
Pleasant
When do you
a
go?
couple of weeks ago, and they had real heavy rain.
It's thick, there's
And I got stuck in downtown.
Yeah.
trying to
The
get
current
over there. I
plan
couldn't,
is to go
I mean, I sat in traffic all the time.
June
Yeah.
8th, after council's
An
on
hour
the 7th.
before I just
I'll
gave
probably
up and
miss
turned
the
around and
planning.
said,
Like, no,
No, because
I
this
know,
is,
cause normally I have to try to
Yeah, it's
navigate,
not
like
for
when I'm
3
here at
weeks.
work and it's like pouring, I'm like, okay, you
yeah,
have to leave, and
July
then I have to try to
7th.
figure
I'll be
out,
gone for 3
which I
weeks.
know a route to get home if I
So
have
I'll
to,
miss
but
Ways
it
and
becomes
Means, I
just a
think.
maze to try to figure out which
But I
roads
won't
to
miss
take to
council.
get home.
when I was working downtown, I was doing that a lot.
Yeah, oh,
I mean, you know, it got to the point where we just like, if it was a heavy rain
Yeah.
in the afternoon and we knew it was high tide, you just like, well, let's go find a bar.
I know.
Or just wait it out.
yeah, I know.
Because there's just no point in leaving when
No.
it's like that.
Cause you're just gonna be stuck, or you're gonna have to try to turn one way, and then it just becomes a mess. If you guys wanted to spread out, yeah. You can spread a little bit more, cause Klaus won't be
That's-
here, he's not
They
here.
can't
Do
do
they
that.
wanna move or no? Do those two wanna move? You and I.
Look like they do.
You want me to move down, you guys can spread, or are you okay?
No, we're fine.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I was out of order.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I know, I didn't, I've been in the
There's one right here.
What are we looking for?
She's getting an agenda for herself.
Oh. She wrote it.
She doesn't remember all the things, all the brilliant things she said.
No, no.
I know Claus, is Claus,
He's
She's
away.
not
I
here.
know, is he calling in or is he not on? I couldn't tell from the emails I passed.
No,
Okay.
he's not, he's started traveling Friday, so.
Well, let me go ahead and call the special town council meeting to order. And I see this, I know we have some things, some drafts or a draft, written. But I think we really need to just have, first and foremost, kind of an open discussion and Joe and Stephanie, I would ask you both to liberally jump in and help us here, both with the history and in the consideration of what we need to do. What initiated calling this meeting was the concern middle of last week or early last week that over the last month, obviously if I go back to the start of this thing, the primary driver for the many different restrictions and actions that have been put in place were predominantly the governor and Governor McMaster's orders with the advice of his medical support. And most of the requirements that we've put in place in our ordinances 2020-1 and 2020-2 for the most part have been requirements that were put in place either to support or build on things which the governor had put in place, or in a few places, we had stepped out and taken actions that were not in the governor's orders because we felt that they were both supported by or not, at least not inconsistent with anything that the governor had ordered, and were important for Keolis. So for example, jumping out when we did to restrict short-term rentals, for example. But it's also been obvious here in the last 3 weeks or so that we are now, the governor has been in the process of reversing with the desire to try to reopen the state to business and reopen municipalities to business, has been periodically pulling back and rescinding a large number of those orders. And I think, you know, overall there have been about 35, 40 governor's orders.
We're up to 40, I believe.
We're up to
yes.
40. It's been.
Well, that's 40 this year. They're not all.
But there were a couple in there that were not
Yes.
COVID related, but they're probably 30 to 35 of them are COVID related. It's kind of startling how many we actually have responded to. But he's been pulling them back. And it generated the question in the last week, particularly I've been getting them from some of our businesses. Well, I've actually been getting them from our businesses, but also from private citizens who are, to some extent, then confused about what's still in play and what is not. Because in some cases, the governor has been pulling things down. We may, in our 2001 or 2021 or 22, still have things that related to things the governor's pulled down. So the point was, I think that we agreed middle of last week that we needed to sit down and really reconcile what are all of the things that the governor has taken down, what's left, and then look at what we had and make sure that we are where we want to be, that we are not, that we don't have in place things that have either been rescinded by the governor, and therefore we don't have a basis for having them, or be clear that the things we do have are things we want. So this was sort of set a fair. So that was the middle of the week. What's even muddied it up more, of course, is even since then, the governor then acted on Friday. I think it was on Friday to make some more changes, including pulling down the restrictions on the non-essential, the opening of retail without the capacity limitations and things which we also had in place. And that's been giving, as a result, issues from our businesses. I've been getting questions of, for example, is the 10-person restriction still in place or not in place? The answer is it is, even though the governor doesn't have that as an order. Over the weekend, then the question of what are the requirements for businesses, essential businesses, non-essential businesses, and since most of our orders were going to expire on their own in about January 4th? One of the questions was July 4th. What did I say? January?
Yeah, that's what-
Starts with the same letter, and that's as good as I can get right now.
Yeah.
Was going to expire on July 5th. One of the questions that has been, well, do you just do we just leave them in order, leave them there for a few more weeks and just let them expire? Or should we, because the governor's pulled so many things back, go ahead and start clarifying and making those changes now? And that's particularly an issue because we have a lot of businesses who, because of July 4th, are interested in what restrictions we have because it impacts the kinds of things they might want to or normally do on the 4th. I'm pretty much of the view that none of the businesses here intend to do some of the major things they've done in the past, like fireworks and so on. I think for the most part, those are probably all not going to occur. But there have been historically a lot of other events, other club related or resort related, and so what they're looking for is guidance. And it just happens that if we just let our things they elapse sort of the day after the 4th. So they're looking for some clarity on that. So that's a long lead up to what we want to do. So I think we need to have a good discussion about where we want to be on this. What you have in front of you is a draft. And I don't know, Petra, can you put that up?
She can put it up.
We've got it.
We have it in front of us.
Oh, okay, I got it. We've got it on paper here.
We have it.
And is this the one you changed this morning?
Yes.
Okay. So we have a draft that I thought was at least the basis for starting the discussion. And what the draft does is essentially starts off by saying we are eliminating all of the restrictions that we have put in place in our 2020-1 or 2020-2 unless they still exist in a governor's order and have not been rescinded by the governor. So as a general rule, that's kind of the starting point. And on that basis, almost everything goes away. So the restriction that we have on groups exceeding 10 unrelated people would go away, and I think that is the major one that most businesses are concerned or interested in right now. It also eliminates, which the governor's action Friday did, eliminates the capacity constraint of 5 people per 1,000 square feet or 20% of occupancy for non-essential retail stores. So, clothing stores and sporting goods stores and so on.
So he's taking that away.
He took that away on
Friday.
Friday. Right, he took that away on Friday. So
Okay.
that would eliminate, so if you, and I know it gets confusing, if you think about it then, let's take Freshfields. That would leave you in a position where most of the retail stores would have under this no restriction on, essentially on their operations. Okay, they would be back to being to operate under full capacity. Our constraint that said you had to show capacity would go away because you only needed to do that if you were under an order to have less than full capacity.
They're still subject to guidelines,
They are subject,
voluntary.
they are subject to, if there are voluntary guidelines for their particular business. So what it does leave, and I had this discussion with Freshfields over the weekend, because this is the confusion, is one of the questions that comes up, and tell me if I've gotten the answer wrong, is, well, what did the governor's action do on Friday to restaurants? And my answer to them was, well, it doesn't affect restaurants because the restaurants did not have a capacity restriction of the 5 per 1,000 or the 20%. When they were allowed to reopen, they were allowed to reopen under pointing to the Restaurant Association's guidelines and told that they should follow those, but it was not, and so they have been driven by a different different action from the governor, which said, here's some guidelines, and I'll paraphrase, you should do them as you want.
And
Do you see that differently?
just to read it, well, I think that is the correct interpretation of all this, but it's certainly subject to some dispute. Just because things have gotten so convoluted in these orders, when they reopen the restaurants, as y'all all may know, the restrictions that were included in that reopening were voluntary.
Right.
However, there was an older order that had the occupancy restrictions that were mandatory, and that frankly, I think everyone had forgotten about that. I didn't realize it was still technically in place until Friday.
But that one never,
That is a different,
it never impacted the restaurants though.
well, I think you
Because the
may be
rest-
right.
because the
It's very
restaurants-
confusing.
Because the restaurants were shut,
Yeah.
when he went to having the occupancy order for essential businesses, I mean.
And that's not the same thing that got rescinded Friday.
Right, but he had the occupancy order for essential businesses, he had the occupancy order for non-essential businesses, retail, well, he had shut down the other things. And since restaurants were shut down originally, they were never operating under the 20% and 5 per thousand. So when they
Right.
were allowed to reopen, they reopened under the Restaurant Association guidelines.
Volunteer.
That's right.
Voluntary. So the base, so the answer that I have given to, and this is why we gotta clean this up, is the answer that I've given to.
Mayor? You need to come up closer to
Is anybody, do we have anybody on the line by line? I'm sorry then. So, you know, the answer that I've given Freshfields over the weekend is that the retail businesses, you know, a clothing store, the bookstore, you know, whatever, that their restriction by the governor's order on Friday, their restrictions on occupancy have come off. They can, right or wrong, they can cram as many people in those stores as they want.
You agree with
Well,
that? You agree with that
That's right.
interpretation?
They've gone, yes.
Okay.
However,
Second, just so what I'm telling, is that with respect to restaurants,
well,
that the guidelines in a place for restaurants are those which were promulgated by the South Carolina Restaurant Association as included in the governor's order that said when we initially opened restaurants to outside dining, then opened them to inside dining, he included in his order
yes.
a reference to the Restaurant Association guidelines and said, these, go to the website, these are the guidelines that you should follow. But he emphasized guidelines.
That's right.
And my sense on Kiowa is that for the most part, if you'd asked me a week ago, I'd say most of the restaurants were following those guidelines with respect to occupancy, which were they primarily dealt with 50% occupancy, spacing tables, and that sort of thing. So that's the position I think we have with dining, and we in our ordinances have never had anything that has separately impacted restaurants. So the only thing that leaves, which is in this proposed order, is the one, I say the one, there's a couple, essential business, which is grocery stores.
Well,
banks and pharmacies.
and this is, where the difficulty becomes is there's, from what I am reading, there is one section left that's still effective with these occupancy limits and social distancing requirements, mandatory.
Which are the essential businesses.
And it's 2020-21, subsection 1I of the executive order that's never been repealed. And the way it reads, and this was the executive order that originally put in place the stay-at-home order, if we all remember. And there was a long list of businesses that had to close. And then it said, and those businesses that are not listed above but get to stay open are subject to these rules. And that's never been repealed by the governor. So to me, it's confusing, but perhaps there's method behind all of this. But it's confusing in that non-essential businesses all the businesses that got shut down are subject to no rules or voluntary rules. But essential businesses that are not really defined, but only listed as, the best way I could say it is businesses that never had to shut down.
Pharmacies, grocery stores.
Pharmacies, grocery stores, banks,
Banks and gas stations, I think.
gas stations are still subject to these mandatory occupancy rules. And maybe that's intentional. I'm not real clear on why one would be, maybe it's because everyone has to go to the grocery store and the pharmacy, and so we're gonna leave in the mandatory rules.
But do we have, we talked about.
But that's the best that I can figure it out.
But one of the questions we talked about last week was, do we have the sense anywhere in reality that whether, if you go to Charleston or if you go in any other community, Mount Pleasant, are they interpreting, or are those establishments interpreting that they are covered by those rules?
Well, I think you've happened upon the second issue with all of this is the enforcement. And I don't know that there's really any enforcement going on. I mean, at the end of the day, I'd say it's for the state to do that, perhaps the counties. I don't see a lot of businesses with people outdoors counting who can come in and who can't.
We have just one. And I think
mean,
that gets to the thrust of the discussion
Right.
here, because I think if you were to go at this two ways, what would our property owners and residents like to see? And they're all over the place, so I don't want to suggest that there is even a property owner view on this. What would they want to see in terms of protecting their health and safety and having them feel more comfortable? What is enforceable, and where are the real pandemic threats? I think what you would hear on this island, and what is premised in this draft, is that our one major grocery store is the one area of concern. I don't think, we have probably, if you're limited to grocery stores, we have, I think, 4 locations that would fall under that category: Harris Teeter, the station, the town market, the station, and the general store. Which only one of them is enforceable, which is Harris Teeter, or has any chance of being enforced, which is Harris Teeter. And that's because there are a lot of people there. It's public. There's more ability. The general store is given up. I mean, they've made it clear that the potential for harassment of their employees has been too great. They can't manage it in that little store over there, and they can't put their employees at the risk of telling people not to come in. The market is still enforcing that. They're not letting people in the store. But at the end of the day, those aren't the major, the major concern from a public health standpoint has always been Harris Teeter, on the basis that it is a very small store. It is the only store of size, and therefore, for most of the community, it is the place to be able to go. And that if you did not have capacity constraints to that store, it would be very difficult to keep the population protected otherwise, because there's just not enough room for social distancing, for keeping people 5 or 6 feet away. And so I think that's the issue that you get down to, is there is, on all of this community, one business that still plays a very important role that I think people would still like to see safeguards, to see it safer. But there's the question of, do you pick out one type of business, and do you have the ability to enforce it? And do we have the ability, and do we have the legal right to do that?
Yeah, so I'll answer your last question first. To be clear, when I talk about enforceability and the difficulties there, I'm not legally, any local authority has been authorized to enforce the governor's orders.
But
And that is
but that's dependent on you concluding that order 2021 of his has not been rescinded, or is not about to be rescinded, or hasn't just been an oversight.
Well, it really hadn't, correct, yes. But I want to make it, again, I mean, every single one of the governor's orders has made clear that local authorities are authorized to enforce these orders, right? So that is very clear. And this subsection that's quoted in our proposal today has not been explicitly repealed. Now, it may be an oversight, but it's not clear to me that it, and I would point out that, I mean, I am aware of other stores that are similarly situated in terms of size, being small and important to the community, that do limit access. As y'all know, I'm from Foley, and we have a place called Burt's out there, which is the only store out there really. And they have a person out there because it's so small and people are there all the time, limiting the occupancy.
But is that
So it's
being-
not unheard of.
But is that being done voluntarily by the establishment, or is it being done by?
You know, that's a good question. I think they're doing it voluntarily because they would be overrun without it.
And
And-
of course, the sense from discussions I have is that Freshfields and Harris Teeter will not do this on a voluntary basis. That they they are not willing to, and they did not want this in the first place, and would not retain it. Now, over the weekend, I've not been able to get a hold of Kroger and Harris Teeter to ascertain that, but past discussions have suggested that they are not interested in voluntarily keeping this in place.
One of my concerns is, well, two things. I think 4th of July, from what I hear, rentals are through the roof.
Well,
They're
they're
gonna
Well, they
be-
are now.
Even
They are-
before 4th
they
of
are
July.
now, yeah.
Right.
So you're gonna see that store overrun
Yeah.
with people, including families with 10 people, coming in from wherever. And right now, we're seeing the daily rate go up and up
Right.
and up and up, to the point where I know some
Of
residents in
coronavirus.
Kiowa are driving to the Bees Ferry, Harris Teeter, in order to avoid Freshfields. So that's not good for Freshfields either. I am concerned about the true health, forget all of the rules, the health risk involved with Harris Teeter today. I think we're making it could get awful in terms
This
of what
is a shared concern in many communities, not necessarily grocery stores, but I mean,
just everything.
our restaurants and bars are just at night. It's
Fact.
frightening.
It is.
See, I talked with the club last night, or yesterday afternoon, and we were making a dinner reservation for later this week. They are following very strong disciplines. You're gonna either be out on the porch, or you're gonna be in certain seats inside. They're limiting occupancy, they're limiting space. I mean, they're doing all the things you'd like to see.
And the
So-
resort is doing that with their
And the
restaurants.
resort is doing the same thing, yeah. And the resort is following, but you know, they've lifted some restrictions. You don't need a reservation for a get on the driving range now. We used
Oh,
to have
right.
to do that stuff, but they're really staying tight, and they're all concerned
They are.
about, the holiday weekend. So,
I definitely think there's variation in the amount of effort being put into that
Yeah.
by business.
Joe, let me ask a question. If we were to simply eliminate or suspend all of our emergency orders, the situation then from a legal standpoint is that the governor's one existing paragraph subsection I-1, that is really the only emergency order that is still in place. And that's at the state level. Do I have that correct?
Executive order, right, but, well, that.
There are some other, there's some
There are a few
education,
others.
school ones, and there are other things, but.
And I will say
effectiveness.
the prohibition, there's a provision that's cited by a lot of people that says if there are 3 or more people gathered together in a public place and in the law enforcement officer's discretion, they're posing a threat to public health, he can disperse those people.
So that's still in effect.
That is still there. That is about the only one that's, directly gonna potentially impact a municipality. As Craig pointed out, there's school stuff and DHEC stuff and, stuff that's kind of outside of our jurisdiction. But that's about it. And the rest of it, and putting aside all the voluntary. Now, I mean, there's many orders and discussions of industry guidelines, even the Friday
But those
thing.
aren't enforcement issues to us. I mean, we have no right to enforce any of those voluntary
Well,
guidelines.
I mean, enforcement, you can't write tickets over it, but I mean, you can encourage people to adhere to them. But
And then if we were to adopt something along these lines that says, okay, we would like to single out the issue of grocery stores, pharmacies, banks, do we have that ability to do that and really only enforce it on one entity, Harris Teeter, when we choose not to enforce it on another entity,
well,
whether it be the general store or the station?
I that's not the way. I mean, I would view it more as enforcing it where it needs to be enforced.
Or is there a way to actually further narrow the definition, so that you are lights go on.
We're losing power.
So that what is covered are entities whose primary business is the terminology we had for grocery stores, because the other grocery selling establishments, that's not their primary
That's correct.
business.
I get concerned about
I-
selective
I don't
enforcement.
like-
I agree with you, Chris. I
Using
agree.
our order to carve out different, I mean, the law is the law, no matter what. I mean, the state law, the governor's orders that reflect the law, it is what it is, regardless of what we do. We could get rid of all of our emergency orders and still enforce the state law.
That's my question.
Yes.
Okay.
That, to some extent, this is a formality, what we're doing.
It's an extra layer.
It's a way to emphasize.
Well-
What I don't like is straying away. If you're going to say, well, this is the governor's order and it's still in effect, I would rather keep it as close as possible to what the governor actually said and allow the enforcement to be done in an appropriate way based on who needs to be reminded of the governor's order.
If this
Well,
is
If that makes sense.
I was just saying, but the other reason, Chris, I think though, if this is what we want to have in place, that we don't rely just on the governor's order, is because otherwise we're going to be potentially back with these entities arguing about whether the back into this question of, well, is the governor's order still in place and not in place, and do we have the ability to enforce it? If we in fact have the order in place here, that debate goes away. We've put the order in place, and so therefore we can enforce it, because otherwise I suspect that Kroger will fight us on whether the order, whether the governor's order is even still in place and still
Is-
affects them.
Is Kroger enforcing this order, which is a statewide governor's order, in any location?
I don't know.
I question
mean,
whether they're enforcing it in the Bees Ferry example that
Well,
you use.
Bees Ferry is not a problem because it's a new
It's
store.
larger,
It's very
It's
large.
huge.
but have
They
they,
have like 3 people in there at one time.
I think that's the answer to all of this. If you go into a store that's big enough, it's self-enforcing.
It is.
I go to a Harris Teeter, and there's plenty of space in there, and they don't need, the problem comes when you're dealing with smaller stores and smaller areas, and I think that's the answer to a lot of these issues about enforcement and whatnot. I mean, they're just, for better or worse, 90% of the grocery stores out there have adequate room to accommodate their customers. There are a few unique places that don't, and do need to be reminded of these orders that are still in place.
That's a little bit where my head is on this, that in our circumstance here, since we're charged with the health and safety of this community, including our guests, that particular grocery store, regardless of the brand, represents the single biggest concern on the part of residents. And I would be very concerned about going into a busy holiday period with cases going through the roof, not having restrictions on that store. So we gotta,
Well, I think the dilemma is singling out one business for enforcement.
but I'm saying,
But
I'm not singling out a business, it's the circumstances that surround a grocery store which is essential in a very small space with crowds coming in. We know what it's like normally, right?
Yes.
And part of the argument all along with that has been that, and we've said this in our communications, that directionally where this whole thing has been moving is for people now, for businesses to have to take the responsibility
Right.
to act responsibly in the conduct of their business, and for individuals to be able to assess their own risk and
Right.
make decisions. And so for almost all of the businesses and almost all of the recreational opportunities available on Kiowa, you have the ability to make you can decide not to go to the beach, or when to go to the beach, or where you can go. You can decide that you don't have to go walk around Freshfields and gaze in store windows. Most everything is discretionary. But Harris Teeter is the one location on this island where, you can even decide, I don't feel like going to Turtle Point and eating a hamburger. But Harris Teeter is the one point where you ultimately have a mix of the 6,000 rentals or tourists who are coming in from all over, and our resident and non-resident owners, who ultimately, this is the one place where there's limited ability to use discretion to not go there. Yes, some people will say, I'll only go to Costco, or I'll only go to, but for all practical purposes, this is the one spot where those populations are going to mix. And so I think the public health issue is that so unique that this requires us to continue to keep an extraordinary measure in place to try to manage that. Because if people are going to get sick, it isn't because they rode a bike past each other on the bike path or sat 20 feet away from each other on the beach, but it is because we tried to crowd. What did Harris Teeter, when we first got into this, they contended their occupancy was what,
That was like 220.
almost 300, yeah, and we've got them down to 97, 99. At 300 people in that building, there is no social
couldn't
distancing, yeah.
And I think what you just articulated, in my mind at least, is maybe why they've left the mandatory restrictions in place for essential businesses, because you have to go to those businesses.
Yeah, I don't,
Nobody has any choice. You can choose not to go to a restaurant. And so I think in that thinking may be behind the governor's thinking of, we'll leave these essential businesses under these mandatory restrictions. That's my belief as to what's going on there.
let's turn the discussion for a moment to the other major change here, because I think most everything that this rescinds is pretty clearly been rescinded by the governor. We had one item in here that was the restriction on groups of unrelated people in excess of 10, which was really predominantly a Kiowa order. The governor actually referenced it, but I don't know that the state actually did have that as an order. This proposal essentially reflects the fact that in the opening of restaurants, in the opening of businesses, that ultimately the behavior throughout the state is in no way elsewhere limiting things to 10 people. And that it is time for that restriction to go away, both because it's inconsistent with all of the rest of the things that are occurring, and then essentially our inability to enforce that. So I'm certainly interested in the thoughts of the council members on that item. And Joe, if I characterized correctly?
Yes.
I suppose I'm not sure, are we rescinding the 10?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm fine with that.
You're keeping
I'm
in the
okay with that, too.
6.
It's a 6 feet distance.
Right.
Limiting 10, yeah.
This does, although if you want to get into the question of enforcement, I mean, it has been recommended that we leave in the 6. I don't know how one, and that's written as a,
Again, that's right.
Social distance practicing,
Right.
3B.
I just feel like it's important, if we're going to cite and quote the governor's order, that we do the whole thing, not bits and pieces.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
I would agree.
I think that's the
Me
logical
too.
position to take.
yeah, it's just, as much as I think the 10 grouping has served us very well.
It has.
And I would place a lot of the success that the community's had in not subjecting itself to an outbreak of the virus to the fact that I think our residents have done a really good job
They
of
have.
paying attention to that. But it's unfortunately sitting now really as an anomaly, and it's to the extent that you are on the one hand telling businesses they no longer have retail, you can open up with no constraints in terms of occupancy. It becomes very contradictory if at the same time that they're being told that they can do that, we're having some order that says, oh, but you can only have 10 people in the same area, so. Now,
So-
it does potentially open up, and I expect that as a result, we will see some very large activities. But again, going back to the requirement that businesses be responsible and follow the advice that they've been given from MUSC, from DHEC, and from others, that they then therefore take the necessary steps to ensure that if they have larger crowds, that they're not endangering those people.
Can I try to interpret this and put it in English language so that I can understand it? Because we talk a lot of these legalities, and, you know, I'm reading the whereases and therefores. Basically, what we're trying to do is to rescind the existing orders that are no longer consistent with what the governor has put through executive orders
That we had adopted.
that we've adopted.
Yes.
We would rescind those prior to the July 5th date that they would rescind on their own, basically
Correct.
fall off. We are making sure that we keep a layer on, consistent with the governor's executive orders, for the essential businesses, and the one we've spoken most about is Harris Teeter.
Yes.
But at no point are we putting anything in place that isn't consistent with what the state guidance already is. Is that correct?
That is correct. I mean, the words consistent with can be subject to a lot of debate and have been. We do have an addition requiring the posting of the occupancy
Okay.
limits and, you know, one member of a family.
Yes, the signage.
Right. I feel like that is consistent with the governor's order because it's just a mechanism for effectuating.
It's also helpful.
It is.
Well,
How do people
exactly.
understand unless it's
It's-
written?
Absolutely.
But, I mean, I don't think that's in doubt.
Okay.
But it is, I mean, if at most it's a step, it's just helping to effectuate and provide
Well, it
information.
certainly it is not a step too far.
No.
No, I don't
no.
feel, that I feel comfortable with,
It
very much
actually
so.
relieves the store owner
Yeah.
of having to continually explain something that doesn't need explaining. Here's our limits, you know.
Okay,
I think it's very
I'm
useful.
comfortable.
All right, one other issue I want to bring up for discussion, I'm not making a recommendation, but I want to bring up for discussion because I am getting more, questions and comments about it, and it has been the subject of, more increasingly a subject of debate, in South Carolina and other states, which is the wearing of masks, of which, while, you know, I mean, I watch the debates that go back and forth of whether they're effective and not
Right.
effective, but but at the end of the day, it does seem that the arguments for their effectiveness in reducing the contagion is effective. The governor has certainly stayed away from, and I think made it pretty clear that he has no intent to require masks. We have not included it as a requirement here, at least in my mind, on two bases. One, because we have in fact been following the governor's lead and not taking the view that we could or should be putting things in place that are not consistent with or have emanated from one of the requirements of the governor. And second, for most businesses, the governor has explicitly told them to operate based upon guidelines and considerations that have been placed for their business, so bowling alleys are being told, here's the best way to run a bowling alley, and restaurants have been told, here's how you should run a restaurant. And as part of that, either MUSC or DHEC or the Restaurant Association or the Bowling Association has provided them with guidance on whether they should or shouldn't require masks. So we've not included it here, I think, from the basis that that there is not an order in place to do that, that businesses are being provided guidance, and the approach has been to let them make those decisions. That also independent, I don't have any, I mean, I can read articles, but we don't have any independent medical advice that is being given to us in Kiowa that says we should be mandating masks. So I have been getting a fair number of requests that we consider mandating masks in the town, but we've not included it for those purposes. I would think that, you know, we've continued, and I'm gonna continue to periodically communicate to the community that
Right.
this is not over.
Right.
That, I mean, anybody who is paying attention sees that the number of cases is increasing, and that here are the various kinds of things they ought to be doing, but I haven't seen a basis for us to be able to or that we should be requiring masks. So it's not in here, but I think I'd like to hear from everybody else on that issue, because I don't wanna pretend I've had an overflow
Right.
of emails, but the ones I've had have made the case pretty passionately.
If I may speak, Mayor, I would say that masks are really a personal responsibility. If you notice, many stores now say you can't go in without a mask. We were in Georgetown yesterday, and all the stores said, enter with the mask. The museums, enter with the mask. All of these items, and I'm really concerned about the increase in the number of cases, because I knew in April when on our calls they kept saying this is the peak, April 9th, April 11th. I said, we haven't peaked at all. And what I'm concerned about is we have been very fortunate here in Kiowa because the residents have taken personal responsibility and followed what was recommended. I don't think it's time to stop reminding them. I know this mask issue is a big one. Many people feel if you go out, if you're in another area, you're gonna see people, some with masks, some without. The governor is being encouraged to put in a requirement for masks, but he has not given into that yet, and I don't know that he will. But again, if we go back to personal responsibilities, I'm really worried that we're gonna have I hope this doesn't happen, we're gonna have an outbreak here in Kiowa because of the influx of vacationers, which we welcome, but it's just normal, you increase the population, and we're not all here in our little contained space. I think anything we can recommend is helpful. And I would encourage you, Mayor, in your messaging to the public to continue to reinforce the steps that are helping us stay away from coronavirus. And I'm talking about washing your hands, the social distancing, et cetera.
I'll comment. I agree with a lot of what you just said. I think I thought, and probably a lot of people thought, that when we got into June and July, this thing would be at the tail end. And it's clear we're nowhere near the tail end. And we don't know where the tail end's gonna be. If we have to wait until a vaccine gets developed, we may be living with this the rest of this calendar year. Given that, I think the ordinance as being presented makes great sense. But along with what Mary Ann has talked about, I would encourage you, Mayor, to communicate what we've done here to the public and to our citizens, along with guidelines on please wear your mask when it's appropriate. Now, sitting out on your back deck, I don't expect you to wear a mask. When you're having dinner at home, I don't think it's easy to wear a mask. I haven't figured out how to eat and wear a mask. However, when I go to the gas station, when I go to Harris Teeter, when I go anywhere in Freshfields, I've got a mask on. And I encourage everyone, and I know you feel the same way, I hope you do, Mayor, that we just got to encourage people to continue to do it, because I do think it's probably one of the best things we can be doing.
I've got nothing to add, there's nothing to disagree with.
I just, I know we're talking about masks right now, but before we end, could we clarify the restaurant position again? What's going on with the restaurants? Do they still have to maintain the social distancing?
Well, my interpretation is that they have been provided guidelines.
Right, from the Restaurant
From the
Association.
Restaurant Association. That Restaurant Association, those guidelines include a lot of factors. They include some capacity, at 50% or whatever capacity. They include things about how far tables should be spaced apart. A lot of backroom requirements, from hygiene to everything to, what do you do with the salt and pepper shaker and the menu. They also include things even on the issue of masks. But they were just that, guidelines.
Okay,
And I think if you spend, as you all probably have, any amount of time out around the broader Charleston community, you will see every degree of compliance or non-compliance with those guidelines. And I mean, I've been to some that are absolutely, you know, tables are spaced, the occupancy's down, they're, and then I've seen and walked away from those that there's no semblance at all. And I'm not criticizing them because, I mean, I understand too, people, you know, there are restaurants with different customer bases and different price points. They either can or can't make it work. And I think that's where it gets back into this issue we have to keep pushing, which is, for right or wrong, for 3 months, our property owners and residents were basically, the public was basically told, here's how you should, we're not gonna give you a lot of discretion, here's the rules, here's how you need to act. We're not gonna let renters come in, we want you to stay home, you gotta, you know, we did it, but it was taking away all discretion from them. And then overnight, we went the opposite direction and said, okay, now you're gonna have to make the decisions, you need to understand your own risk profile, you need to understand what you're comfortable with doing, what your medical issues are, and you decide. And when you see the restaurant that's not spaced out, but spaced out, you make and the one that's not, you make the decision to go or not go. And I see it at Freshfields. I think more of the restaurants at Freshfields are attempting to be on the more responsible side, but not all. And I think that's they're doing what the governor gave them the discretion to do. Now, as an aside from that, and I've had this conversation with a couple of business owners on the island, I think the biggest concern as a community we're all gonna have is that it unfortunately appears like, particularly in a tourist community, it appears like the visitor base is very comfortable as a whole going to those restaurants that are not particularly putting a lot of effort into distancing and so on. And at some point, if that's what you have happening, how long can the other restaurants really hang in there?
right, I agree.
Sacrificing their business to lower density, fewer customers, spending money on a lot more stuff. And at what point are they gonna end up having to throw in the towel?
I totally
Not because they
agree.
want to, but simply because they're saying, look, you know,
The
we're
economics.
doing all this and we're not getting rewarded for it. The restaurant that does nothing is packed. That's the concern I have, out here.
The good thing is you have choices.
We talked about the elimination of the 10, I think there's everything else, so if we pass this as is, essentially the only thing we have left in here then is in fact the constraints on essential businesses, which are predominantly on this island, just these couple. Is that right? All right. Any other discussion, or do we want to go ahead and make a motion? I want to just ask Joe a question on here, because we've gotten into this question over the weekend as some of the businesses saw the draft. People got really confused when we said regarding essential businesses that serve prepared food.
That was very confusing.
That got confusing because what some people concluded is, oh, that's restaurants, because when you go into a restaurant, they're preparing your food. And it was really intended to not mean restaurants. It was intended to say, no, when you go into a grocery store, you're buying a can of pork and beans that have been prepared for you. That's the prepared food. So this was intended on the latter. and in the, actual document, you've rewritten that language.
That's right.
Right.
But in the motion here, which is, to consider approval of ordinance 2020-3, an emergency ordinance of the town council of the town of Kiawah Island regarding restrictions on essential businesses that serve prepared food.
I so move.
Do we need to first clean up that? Is that title okay, or does that need to be cleaned up?
I
to make it-
think,
I
yeah,
think it's
why,
very confusing.
I cleaned it up.
yes, I agree.
Okay, do we need to do that first, or can
Why don't we make it an amendment? If, are we, is it,
We
is
have
the
a-
motion on the table?
Well, that's the question is what's the right motion
Was
to
it
make? Should
second?
we have that language in it, or do we need to clean
No,
up?
I would,
Just on essential businesses, period.
yes.
Alright,
Just read that.
alright, so, so do I have a motion to consider approval of ordinance 2020-3, an emergency ordinance of the town council of the town of Kiawah Island regarding restrictions on essential businesses?
So moved.
Do I have a
Second.
second?
Second.
Alright, we've had a lot of discussion, but now it is open for official discussion. Any further comments?
I'd just like to reinforce the importance of communicating the standard procedures that everyone should be taking now.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, we have a motion and a second, all in favor?
Aye.
Okay. So this passes. And we'll need to work with Stephanie Braswell here today, I think, to make sure we communicate all the nuances of what this means
August
And
8th.
plays through August.
through August 8th.
Unless earlier modified or repealed.
Right. And one of the challenges we have on communicating is the fact that with the tourism population in here, they don't get our communications. And, you know, we had, as part of the resolution that we did a few weeks ago with the rental guidelines, one of the elements of that resolution was a requirement that rental owners and or rental property managers communicate to their incoming renters a variety of information, including the fact that we were not immune from this here, and that there were different orders and requirements in place. As best I can tell anecdotally, that has not really
Well,
happened.
except I know myself, because we're staying in a rental unit, that Pam Harrington had sent out all the requirements for cleaning the unit, for sanitizing the sheets and blankets, and she actually put that in a sheet that I had to read before I could
Could do it.
do it.
Yeah, and I think, you know, we had those 4 or 5
Property
key
managers.
property managers who were, you know, who helped us greatly in creating those guidelines, and I think for the most part, they are taking them seriously and trying to communicate it, but beyond that, I'm not finding that there's a lot of communication going on to renters to give them any sense of what's going on, which we'll just have to continue to work on, so. Anything else we need to discuss? All right, do I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
All right, we are adjourned.
Thank you, Mayor.
You all have a nice week. What's that?